Hello and welcome to PMP Live. I'm Alan Watke, part of the events team with Politics and Prose. Thank you for joining us today with Parag Khanna celebrating his new book, Move. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase the book. And you'll be able to ask Parag a question by clicking on the Q&A link, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to the audience questions towards the end of the event. And if we're not able to get to all of them, we apologize for that, but we'll try and make room for those. We do offer closed caption for our events, and you can click on the CC link next to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to enable that. Finally, we want to thank you all for being here today. We're thankful to all of our family of loyal customers keeping PMP afloat. And now I'd like to welcome to PMP Live Parag Khanna, celebrating the release of his new book, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, a compelling look at the powerful global forces that will cause billions of us to move geographically over the next decades, ushering in an era of radical change. Parag is a founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a global strategic advisory firm that specializes in data-driven scenarios and visualizations. He is internationally best-selling author of 7 books, including The Future is Asian, as well as a trilogy of books on the future of world order, beginning with The Second World, followed by How to Run the World, and concluding with Connectography. Parag was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired Magazine's Smart List. He holds a PhD from London School of Economics and both a bachelor's and master's degree from the School of Foreign Services right here at Georgetown University. Parag will be joined in conversation today with Michael Hirsh, the senior correspondent and deputy news editor at Foreign Policy. Previously, he was a national editor for Political Magazine, and he is the author of 2 books, Capital Offense, How Washington's Wise Men Turned America's Future Over to Wall Street, and At War with Ourselves, Why America is Squandering Its Chance to Build a Better World. And so now, please join me in welcoming Parag Khanna and Michael Hirsh to PMP Live. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And thanks to those of you who are here with us. We hope to have an invigorating conversation, and I'd like to start out, Parag, by saying this is a very bold and brave book to be publishing at this juncture, in the sense that the conventional wisdom, at least in Washington, where I am, is really focused on the idea that we're deglobalizing, that xenophobia has sort of taken hold of the national conversation, that with the pandemic, we're looking more and more at closed borders. And yet in your book, you go in directly the opposite way. And you are saying that we need to prepare ourselves for mass migration. And perhaps I think the overarching idea in the book, it seems to me, as you say, it's become an old saw that, geography is destiny, although that's not the case, you say. Mobility, not geography, is really our destiny. So could you talk about that and why you're arguing in this direction now?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Politics and Prose. Really delighted to do this event, and it's really the first or second or first wave. So early conversations that have already been really exciting in terms of teasing out this thesis, and you've packed a lot into that first question, actually. So globalization, migration, the pandemic, US politics, and so forth. So maybe we untangle that a little bit. Migration is part of globalization. It's not all of it. And yes, in the mood in Washington, whatever it may be, doesn't always necessarily correspond to reality in the rest of the world, and may not follow that mood even in the United States. After all, we're a mass migration society, always have been, and I would say it's safe to argue always will be, quite frankly. And just to jump the gun, let's be clear that, as you saw from the most recent census that was just released, right under Trump's nose, America became more diverse, more Latino, more mixed race, and so forth, right? So we will, not in terms of political polarization, but in terms of demographics, look back 10 years from now and say, Trump who? So we have to acknowledge that mass migration is a feature of global society. It's a feature of Western civilizational history. It's a feature of modern life, and it's a trend that has not reversed at all. If you look at Canada's immigration policy, Germany's immigration policy, even Britain, and it's, by the way, easier to migrate into the United Kingdom today than it was before Brexit, like literally right now as we speak. That's not conjecture, that's a legal fact. So even in places that have become the very embodiment of the notion of xenophobic, knee-jerk, border closing, anti-immigrant populism, guess what? Mass migration is alive and well. If you look at Biden's policy, that's one thing. So let's put that to the side. Then the pandemic. Well, I mean, I finished the book before the pandemic, but I fortunately had plenty of time to update and revise, and it only strengthened the argument in many ways. First of all, let's acknowledge that the lockdown was the most significant coordinated act in the history of the world, right? Governments have never so swiftly come together behind anything. And it was you might say, in the opposite direction of my thesis. They closed every border. The world stood still. But people moved home. Right? The largest movement of people in the world in the year 2020 was a couple of million South Asian construction workers and migrant laborers in the Gulf countries, which is, the majority of the population of the Persian Gulf is Indians and Pakistanis, were moved home. And then not only did they move home, they also moved not just to cities, but to farms. And there was a tractor shortage in the state of Bihar, which is a very poor agricultural state in India, not far from where I was born, because people decide to become farmers again, and the agricultural industry is sort of thriving there. So movement within countries, first of all, is a big theme in the book, and the vast majority of human migration is within countries, and I talk about that as well. Again, does it register in Washington that the largest mass migrations are within China, within India, and within Africa? No. Does it make them any less significant for the human species? Of course not. So, my movement is happening all the time. And then coming out of the pandemic, the forces that I identify as being the fundamental deep drivers of human mobility and migration, whether it is climate change, which is, of course, a big one that doesn't stop just because of pandemic lockdown, political conflict, look at Syria and Afghanistan and the refugee flows. And let's jump straight to technology. Right now, people are moving all the time. I bet you and I and everyone in this call knows one or two or handfuls of people who no longer live where they used to because they can now be digital nomads, and that's part of mobility as well. But what we should do as we move forward, and I'm sure we will, is kind of differentiate between situations or trends that apply to hundreds of people, thousands of people, millions of people, and billions of people. And the larger the decimal point goes outward, the more I'm confident in the thesis, precisely because of the deeper trends around labor shortages in aging countries and because of climate change. So I would ask anyone, pose the question sort of rhetorically back to you or to anyone else, tell me that you think, in light of climate change and labor imbalances and so forth, demographic imbalances, that borders are going to stay shut forever and migration has ended, right? Tell me that, and we can debate it.
Yeah. Well, let's jump onto that, which really gets into what you're arguing, the basis for your arguments. I mean, you do make, I think, a powerful case that climate change, if it continues, is going to drive migration mostly to the north and inland, as you say. You also make the case that, contrary to hopes for population expansion, particularly in the COVID era, we're instead witnessing population collapse in many advanced countries, and that is going to create a labor shortage. On the other hand, though, you do describe the many ways in which we can connect up in this sort of digital world. You use the term cloud republics at one point, where people are going to be able to find easier ways to create virtual communities. And so maybe they don't need physically to move as much. That would seem to be a countervailing force. Can you sort that out for us and how that's going to play out?
Sure. I mean, those are two simultaneous trends, both of which involve mobility. So the latter one we just briefly touched on, which is to say, hey, I spend all my entire day in the multiverse. I put on those headsets that Mark Zuckerberg has sold me, and why does it matter where I am? All I need is to be nourished, and I need electricity supply. But again, you want to live in a place that has a stable electricity supply and where you're not going to, have food shortages or whatever. So that's why people are moving. So a cloud republic still entails people moving, in the midst of this pandemic, again, for reasons that precisely relate to taxation of the digital economy. People are moving all the time. People are setting up their businesses in Dubai, for example, or Estonia, or whatever the case may be. So people are moving for precisely this reason. Regulation of cryptocurrencies is front page news every single day, and people physically move in order to be in a jurisdiction that's going to allow them to participate in that economy. So the very high net worth individuals and digital innovators are physically moving on the back of this technology. So just to be clear, there's physical migration involved there. And then indeed, where countries are creating these sandboxes and saying, come and live here because our regulations are going to be different around, drones and drone operations and this sort of thing, people are moving for that, like, whether it's to New Zealand or Malta or other countries. So there's lots of that going on, and it's always going on. And because those people are not numerically significant, but economically very significant as investor migrants, I devote a fair bit of space in the book to examining them, because they tend to be lead indicators of where other people will go. And it can be domestic as well as international. So obviously, the flight from San Francisco to Miami is, again, digital mobility and regulatory arbitrage sparking moves of people. Right. Miami is a direct net beneficiary of the higher cost of living and suffocating, kind of political or environment, at least the way people in the Valley perceive it. And Mayor Francis Suarez of Miami has said, how can I help? Right. Famously. And people have flocked there and their population has grown. Now, on the stuff around, with declining population, I mean, this is one of the most important points of departure of the book, both factually and even sort of normatively. One is the world is not going to be an overpopulated, planet of 15 billion people, nothing of the sort. I followed the demographic forecasting, as I know you have, for 20 plus years. And back in the 90s, as you and I will both remember, there were predictions that the world population reached 15 billion people. Now, I'll go on record right now and say we'll be lucky to reach 9 billion people. Right? Like, I highly, highly doubt the world population will reach 9 billion people. So we were off by, quite a lot, right? It's more than a rounding error. And that's just in 20 years, because demographic forecasters missed everything around urbanization, women's rights, economic insecurity, housing shortages, the pandemic, you name it. We've had these baby busts. So the way I frame the whole thing is, okay, look, we have this planet. And on this planet, we have 150 million square kilometers of terrain, about 100 million of which is habitable. And we have only at most 9 billion people. All of us would fit inside Washington, D.C. if we were standing side by side. We don't have a population explosion problem. Some parts of the world do, like India. But we have a distribution problem. That's really what this is to me, right? And obviously accounting for all of the political obstacles. But is it morally and logistically feasible to achieve a more fair distribution of the world population? Yes. And then in terms of the shortages, remember that we reach this peak humanity, and peak humanity is the phrase that I kind of coined and used throughout the book. We've reached peak humanity in Japan, in Europe, in America, in Canada. Right? We're already past peak humanity. It doesn't matter. The fact that the African population and Indian population is growing is not material to the fact that there's shortages of nurses and elderly caregivers in our nursing homes in America. Yeah. It's already here. We're at peak humanity. Our population would not grow if we were not importing people. So now when you say, hey, everything's remote, why do we need more people? It's like, well, tell that to all the elderly people who died during COVID in nursing homes because there weren't enough caregivers. Obviously, there was not enough oxygen either. But all of the logistics and work, physical human work, non-tradable services, as it's known, that are required to get things from point A to point B and to physically care for elderly people. Find me the robot who's going to do that. Right now in Britain, there is a shortage of 100,000 truckers. In England right now, a wealthy, sophisticated country, they're saying, sorry, guys, no turkey, no bacon, and probably no gas to heat your food at Christmas. And that's not because they don't have enough, robots doing the work for them, right? It's because they have an awful, stupid immigration policy and they're paying the price for it. So I'm ready to embrace the digital world, Michael, bring it on, but it's not here yet.
All right, let's talk about that, because you say that there is no global migration policy, and that's true. And I don't think that many people have pointed that out. And you lay out 4 possible scenarios for the future, 3 of which were extremely grim if we don't grapple with these issues. One of which, though, you point hopefully toward what you call northern lights, when this might be, all of these policies might be adopted more wisely. Talk about that a little bit. What could happen if we don't adopt these policies, those scenarios, and then, going into northern lights and how it could end up much more positively.
Sure. Well, definitely at this time where we're in this standstill, scenarios are helpful, because I'm not, issuing, certitude what exactly will happen. So the book is structured around these scenarios, and 3 of them, as you say, are quite grim and negative, right? So, the scenario called regional fortresses more or less resembles the present, right? We focus on our regional domains. Most migration is regional. We're investing in our own sustainability and renewable energy. We're providing some technology to others. We're saying, here's some technology, but don't come as people, status quo. But again, it's sort of a climate neutral scenario, and it ignores our labor shortages. So it's not necessarily good for us to be doing this, but it could persist for a while. Right. The barbarians at the gate scenario is sort of, look, our climate mitigation strategies are not working, neither diplomatically nor technologically, nor in the markets. Our policies are failing, power shortages, our grids are frying, everyone's fending for themselves, food supply chains are breaking down, the droughts are really cutting off, our food distribution and production. We're becoming survivalists and hunter-gatherers again. And again, each of these 4 scenarios is true. Somewhere in the world right now, regional fortresses is true. In the world right now, the new Middle Ages is happening. The 3rd scenario is barbarians at the gate. That also is happening. It's the new Middle Ages plus the internationalization of migrant spillovers in an uncontrolled way. Well, welcome to the Mexican border and welcome to the Mediterranean Sea. This is happening right now. Land grabs happening now, right? Water wars, resource wars. So that's the 3rd scenario. And then there's northern lights. So there's only one positive scenario in the book. So I'm not a hopelessly naive utopian optimist. We have to thread the needle. I think that's the phrase I use. We have to thread the needle very, very luckily and, forthrightly in ways that we are not actually, today capable of doing, other than locking things down, to reopen the world to migration in this premeditated, gradual, sustainable way in which human beings, billions of them, recirculate from devastated and unproductive regions into places where they can be gainfully employed and hopefully culturally assimilated. And so that's what a scenario is. It's a vision. It's not a pipe dream. It's meant to be a vision. And is it happening? Well, yes, it's called Canada. Welcome to Canada, right? A country that welcomes in 400,000 migrants every single year, 1% of its population. 400,000 people who've never set foot on North American soil, more or less arrive in Canada every single year. Fine, some number of them just came from the US, and a growing number probably will, as I talk about in the book. So is it possible to do Northern Lights? Absolutely, but it's going to be an uphill battle. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about the politics of this, because I think countries that are winners and losers may be those countries that fail to take on this agenda. Canada may be a winner, and the US might in the long run be a loser. And you go into some detail about a country that really grew and thrived and flourished because of its immigration policies and welcoming and becoming indeed a nation of immigrants, is now going in the opposite direction. And let's just take, for example, the infrastructure bill being debated on Capitol Hill right now. Joe Biden is not Donald Trump, and yet he has sold this bill in a rather Trumpian way as a saving grace for American blue collar workers. a way to bring back the American middle class. Okay, no one's talking about immigrants, and in fact, his immigration policy, if anything, is almost as retrograde as Trump's was. How how do you turn that around? How do you get to the point where, as you say, in order to build infrastructure in this country, to really do it well, we are going to need immigrant labor. How do we change the politics here in the United States?
Well, again, I think we have to separate and then bring together infrastructure and immigration, because there is a whole parallel set of proposed reforms around Trump's draconian immigration policies that reach far broader than the current emergency level continuity around what's happening on the southern border, where they're obviously trying to manage the flow and to disincentivize, and dissuade people from just crashing the border because they already have. So I don't have total sympathy for how it's being handled, but you can understand that you don't get to start anew when there's millions of people lining up and waiting, to come into the country. But that said, that would be heavily discounting and ignoring what Biden is trying to do around, massively expanding the H-1B visa quota, allowing the spouses of H-1B visa holders to work, which will really draw in a lot more skilled migrants into the United States because they can be two-income households off the bat. This stuff matters massively. What I just described may be one of these technical, Roman numeral 3,2,B-4 line items in legislation. It's seismic stuff. You're telling the whole world that if you have brains and you're a spousal pair with brains and skills, come to America. That's what the Biden administration is actually saying. And you know what a big deal that is and what it means for our future demographics. I mean, I'm an Indian immigrant to America myself when I was a kid, and, my parents came and we became citizens when I was 15. And it's like, Indians dominate the H-1B visa quota, and they're expanding that. Then the pathway to normalization for undocumented migrants. So I would say that, again, it's sort of like, in immigration, it really does carry on, just think about also climate refugees, think about the devastation, Puerto Rico, Bahamas, Haiti, actually hundreds and thousands of people from the Caribbean and Latin America enter the US just on that basis, and they never go back either. So, we continue to be a mass migration society, people coming from all directions, no matter what. You had, the Biden administration has authorized a return to the record numbers of visas for Chinese students. So Chinese are coming back in huge numbers as well, and a lot of them will also stay. So, and then there's Canada and the growing flows of especially skilled labor across both borders. So, I would say it really defies political short-termism. And I think that's a good thing. It's sort of like supply and demand are playing out in the world of global labor markets if we just let them do so even more. And then infrastructure. So sure, you want to create jobs, you want to spend $1 trillion. Okay, well, find me enough Americans with exactly the skill sets you need to build back better at the speed that you want to. And the answer is there aren't enough, right? And if you, again, look at Britain right now, they're paying truck drivers more than $100,000, and British people still won't get off the couch and do it, right? So, we often have, most people have this misperception that there is this breakneck competition for jobs in the labor market between, sort of indigenous and or local and foreign laborers, and that's not true, and that it drags down wages across the economy, not true, and so on.
Let's just talk about how this gets done a little bit more. Is it just going to be in the long run a jostle between those countries that get it and those that don't? Canada, you point out, surprisingly, that Japan, with its own collapsing population and low birth rate, is turning out to be one of the more enlightened countries. But is there going to be any way of achieving this on a global basis? I mean, you talk about your principle of cosmopolitan utilitarianism, this whole idea we want to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number in terms of getting them to the right places. But who accomplishes that? I mean, there's no global body now in existence there's no global governance of any kind that could achieve that. How does that get done?
And I think that's a great point. So one thing that I want to articulate here as fiercely and harshly as anyone who would criticize the sort of the ideal is that we will never, ever, ever have a global migration accord. Like, we will have international agreements on how to settle and colonize the moon before the governments of the world will actually have a compact that states that the people of the world can circulate freely. The one vestige, and Michael, you've been a war correspondent, you've reported all over the world, you know as well as I do, even not using wonky political science terms, but the one vestige that remains of sovereignty in a world where governments cannot control the flows of pathogens and cyber hacks and drugs across their borders and pollution. The one thing left, even for the weakest states in the world, is the attempt to control your borders against the movement of human beings. And it's the one thing that governments always just. So I'm hardly a utopia. I'm a political geographer by training, right? So we have more borders than we've ever had in history. There, I said it. No one else had to say it, right? So we will never have this. But to go to your previous point, there's the divide in the world. One of the divides is between those countries who get it and those who don't. Those countries that say, you know what, we on a bilateral basis are going to start recruiting these people and those people and these people because we need them. And, multilateralism will take its course and we'll follow along, right? And again, that's Canada. Canada is saying we're going to diversify our economy. To do so, we need people, and we're going to start recruiting them en masse. We're going to take them from everywhere. We're going to have a points-based system for skilled people and a humanitarian system for asylum seekers and refugees, and we're going to keep on growing. And they're not the only ones. The German government has just put out a paper saying they need 400,000 people a year. Now, again, I went to high school in Germany in the 1990s. I was definitely the only brown guy in a pretty significant radius. And today, if you told a right wing, there used to be a party called the NPD. It was like the neo-Nazi party in the 90s. Like, I steered clear of them. If you were to tell me or tell any German politician 25 years ago, my God, it was a long time ago. Oh, it was almost 30 years ago. What am I saying? Oh my God, I'm getting old. Okay, so it's almost 30 years ago. If you told, post-Cold War, post-Berlin Wall German saying, 30 years from now, you're going to have 1 million Africans in your country. You're going to have a couple million Arabs. You're going to have 6 million Turks. They might believe you on the Turks. You're going to have about 500,000 Chinese and 100,000 Indians freely circulating in Germany, many of them actually speaking German, integrating into your economy. Not everything is going to go, smooth and peacefully. You're going to have definitely some bumps in your politics and cultural adoption. But this is your demographic in the year 2021. Every single German, all 80 million of them, actually they overestimated their population in their most recent census, so there's less than 80 million Germans. They would have laughed in your face. Yeah. And today, it's the fastest growing, right? It's the only country in Europe with a growing labor force, and is the role model for industrial sort of productivity. So Germany gets it, right? And Britain, as I alluded to earlier, it's easier to move to Britain today than it was 5 or 6 years ago before Brexit. It used to be that you had to show your proof of employment and pay a security bond. Today, you can be an Indian kid, and if you've graduated college, it's like, just upload your certificate and boom, you're allowed entry into the UK. So, things are changing. In Japan, there are 3 million foreigners living in Japan, which is obviously the highest number in history. So there are a lot of countries that are waking up to this. That doesn't make them cosmopolitan. It doesn't mean that they've embraced a truly borderless, ethos and hold everyone to be equal. But here's one thing that is important, Michael, that you say, how is this going to work? Let me be really clear that at a very technical level, a lot of countries are saying this all or nothing, either you're a citizen or you're not, is not good enough. We need to have 8 different tiers. And this is happening right now, right? This is like what smart countries do. If you look at our immigration policy, it's this absurd alphabet soup, literally A to Z, with a number following every letter. You have 85 permutations, of how to come into America. In other countries, it's like, okay, level 1, level 2, level 3, here's how you do it, here's how you apply, here are your rights and obligations, here's how you can move between the tiers in X amount of time, here's how you apply to upgrade, and it's digital. Welcome to every other country in the world almost, except America, right? So it's totally happening because countries are realizing they need these people.
Right. And do you think that if we don't get our act together here in the United States in terms of, immigration, we're not just going to be outpaced by other countries, but what, you describe in the book as a sort of digital Hanseatic League, as it were, where other countries that do have more enlightened immigration policies join together. Technologies, ideas are shared, supply chains are once again restored to working condition, and we're left behind. I mean, is that a possibility?
I don't really worry about that. I mean, I'm contrary to some people's view, I'm not even remotely a declinist. I'm a regionalist, continentalist. When you study geography, that's the way you're trained to think. And the fact is that North America is going to be just fine, right? I mean, North America is the only truly peaceful, stable continent on the planet. So I don't actually worry at all about the future of North America in general, and even America in particular. I mean, I worry a little bit about our politics, but the fact is that the US is an incredibly attractive destination. And even with climate change afflicting and punishing parts of the US more so than it does Europe, for example, we can recirculate because America is a lot bigger than Europe, right? And Canada is a lot bigger than both America and Europe. So we're resource rich, barely trade dependent, other than a couple of areas where, of course, supply chains, right? I mean, pretty much everything that comes from abroad can be substituted, in America, and almost no other country could say that with a straight face. So it can be done. With industrial policy and brains, and the US can do both, and talent will come, and you can draw on remote talent. Look at how Wall Street kept on humming during the lockdown, not only because they pivoted quickly to remote work, but they massively hired more Indians. Right. So when you think about your financial institutions and consulting companies and digital companies, right? So tech, consulting, and finance, three of the, especially tech and finance, two of the biggest sectors of our economy, why are they going great guns? Because they already draw on a completely massive global labor force, right? Of intelligent people who are serving American corporate interests that in some way recirculates and trickles, into our economy. So I'm not actually worried, quite frankly. And, but that said, you don't want to not be the #1 destination in the war for talent, right? Expats now are leaning towards, let's say, Canada or Britain or, other European countries and even Asian countries, New Zealand, Australia, and so forth. So there'll be a distribution, a less hegemonic distribution of the best and the brightest. Right. Is not evil. It's natural. It's part and parcel of globalization. And it is a sign that more parts of the world are livable politically and viable commercially and economically. I mean, it's something to celebrate, quite frankly.
Yeah. And, I think many Americans may be surprised to learn that perhaps their biggest problem is emigration, not immigration. Right?
Well, yeah, and there's serious people looking at that. I wouldn't have stumbled upon that myself, quite frankly. But it is interesting to see the number. And I document this myself as an expat. Right, the number of expats has doubled since the mid 2000s. Before we go to the questions, I wanted you to sketch out as much detail as you can, as briefly as you can, your vision for what you call Civilization 3.0. I think you project out to 2050. A big feature of it is this idea that, particularly in an era of climate change, people are going to be moving northward and inland, that is. And you really go into great detail across the globe in terms of what might be happening in Russia and Siberia and all the way across to the Far East. Just, talk about that a little bit, how that's going to look if this migration takes place. So the principle of Civilization 3.0 can apply anywhere in the world, not just geographically, but the principle is mobility. The two principles are mobility and sustainability. which is to say more people will move. They'll move, again, coastal to inland, low level to elevation, and so forth. But as we move, for example, like take the Great Lakes region, right? As more people move back to the Great Lakes, because right now the Rust Belt has been depopulating, but it will gain in population because it's more climate resilient. But we should not be, sort of polluting and sort of, sort of having mass migration into an ecologically, sort of frail but habitable zone and then destroying it and trampling it the way we've done so much of the planet. So we have to do mobility with sustainability. So there I talk about how our future housing, our future cities, our future settlements need to be circular, right? You need to collect rainwater and channel it into hydroponic agriculture. You need to have wind and solar power and switchable battery packs, all this kind of stuff. And even these cities, and I've looked at some of the investments and technologies in 3D printed movable housing and so forth. You can actually have millions of people living in low footprint, even mobile, quasi-nomadic kinds of settlements. Not because we want to go back to the days of our ancestors, but because actually it's a sustainable and feasible way to live in a fairly high-tech way. So basically, bottom line is Civilization 3.0 is a global concept that we should all try to follow and have as many billions of people adopt it as possible.
Yeah, but talk about a little bit about some of the countries that might be really advantaged here. For example, Russia, which has a really, very poorly performing economy, but has all of this land that might.
Yeah. So I mean, Russia and Canada share, similar geographic size and latitude, but have very, polar opposite immigration policies. But what I've reported on from the book and my travels all across Russia is that, when you're outside of the Kremlin and away from the vitriolic, xenophobic, racist nationalism, of Putin, you hear a very different story. As soon as you go east of the Ural Mountains, which is most of Russia, I talk to provincial chiefs and governors and mayors and so forth, and they say we need more migrants. We need to have we've got this Chinese investment. We need to build these railways and highways. We want to reconvert these old derelict Soviet era factories and make them productive again. We've got all this agriculture. We're an agricultural superpower now. We don't have enough farmers. We have these universities, but our Russians are dying and aging. So we need students. We should start teaching in English. This is the stuff you've never seen reported out of Russia, right? But this is exactly what the Russians who run Russia, who physically run the majority of the territory known as Russia, tell me and are actually doing all the time. So the future of Russia demographically, economically, climatologically really does look very different than today's Russia.
Yeah. Why don't we see if we can go to some questions from the audience. One question comes from Darcy Olmos, and Darcy asks, what will be the role of the transportation industry, particularly the air transportation industry, both civil and military, in the scenarios you lay out?
Well, so this gets to partially, at least to your infrastructure question, which I think is really interesting. One of the things that we're not doing when we think about the infrastructure spending is to start with the kind of first principles or the deeper trends. So the fact is that climate change is rendering certain geographies unlivable, or at least not affordably or fiscally responsibly livable, like parts of the Gulf Coast or the Carolinas or whatever the question may be, or whatever the location may be. But we're still throwing money at these places. Instead, what you do is you start with the irrevocable realities of climate change. Say, okay, well, what are the most livable parts of America that are going to remain livable? How do we incentivize people to move there, which is exactly what the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA and HUD have formed, this holy alliance, if you will, of federal agencies that are saying, you know what? No more rebuilding in coastal areas that are destroyed and getting destroyed every year. Eminent domain on those locations. Here's your relocation grant. Go spend it in Michigan, not in Louisiana. So we are moving in that direction right now, right? We're doing fairly technocratic things that you wouldn't normally ascribe to the US government, which I think are the right things to do. So we've talked about the climate, the migration, and now the infrastructure. right? Transportation and otherwise, civil and military, which is to say, okay, if we now know where we are directing people into livable geographies that will be more stable, now that's where we should be spending on infrastructure. That's where we should be focusing on improving roads and highways and bridges and, affordable housing, water infrastructure, agriculture, industry, and so on and so on. That is the logical sequence by which you should determine where and how to spend trillions and trillions of dollars. Again, not what's happening right now. Of course, military is interesting as well because study after study out of the Pentagon is saying our bases are in the wrong places. We're spending billions of dollars just repairing and refurbishing bases where they are, rather than moving them also to climate resilient areas. So, again, all kinds of infrastructure, transportation, first and foremost, are vital, to maintaining the kind of civil unity of a society. And I've long, I dedicated a whole previous book, Connectography, to this issue of infrastructure, that that we do it in a logical way, because of course, if you don't really have that infrastructure, you're not really a United States at some level.
Yeah. Let's go to another question here from Kiran Pervez, who asks, we've heard in the recent past a lot of similar rhetoric about democratization and globalization and so forth, but none of these promises of connectivity have been completely delivered, in part because our regulatory architecture is built on different technologies. What can we do differently now, Kiran asks, to harness the empowerment that you talk about through mobility? In other words, I think the focus is on how can we change our regulatory policy.
Right. So this is another one of these areas where, you're not going to have a collective global action immediately, right? We see that there's, if anything, a bifurcation in how China views, digital regulation versus Europe versus America. There's a shorthand that I've heard, in America, companies own your data. In Europe, the people own the data. And in China, the government owns the data. The reality is, of course, quite a bit of a melange of those, depending on where you are. But I worry less about the digital divide than, this is another one of these areas where if you go back to the 1990s, this was when the term sort of came of age. But again, if we were in the 1990s, would people have imagined that Africa would be a leader in mobile money, that you'd have global crypto e-wallets, and that that the super apps on Asian mobile phones, which is to say their access to everything, communications, financial services, social media, e-commerce, would be far superior to any Western country, like far superior, right? That's not something you would have heard in the 1990s, but all of those are factually true. So, I think that my general rule is, more trade is, not having enough trade is a bigger problem than unfair trade, right? Not spreading digital technology or less digitization is a bigger problem than the digital divide, and so on. So yeah. I'd like to see us just continue to invest in these areas, and we will kick off those processes. Does that mean, again, global harmonization around digital regulation? No, but we also tend to paint this negative linear picture around the new tech Cold War, which is not really. We don't actually live in a world that line of reasoning presupposes, which is to say that there's only two choices in the global marketplace for technology. Not true, right? And that you have to choose between a Chinese and American model for all technologies. Not true, right? The fact is that monopolies, to the extent they exist, have been allowed to occur simply because of cost advantages and certain assumptions, but that can also change. So Huawei had 30-something% of the global 5G market. Now it only has 20% because the US and Western economies and Japan woke up and said, wait a minute, let's simply not let that happen. And let's, encourage lots of countries to diversify their partnerships. Then even Chinese companies are saying, and they're actually telling their own leadership this, hey, wait a minute, when you force us to identify too much with the Chinese state, we lose business opportunities abroad, and therefore we can't actually become influential global companies anymore. So you've got to pipe this down. So there is a non-linearity to all of this stuff that tends to not be acknowledged when we posit some kind of inexorable new Cold War on technology.
Yeah. Let me follow up on that previous question by taking you back to your book, Connectography, written pre-pandemic. And yet, in many ways, you anticipated the kind of world we're dealing with now, where we've just been plunged into this world of virtual connectivity, including today's session about your book, which normally would have been a pleasant chat among a bunch of us in Northwest Washington at the Politics and Prose bookstore. And has now turned into something where I'm speaking to you from Washington, and you're in Singapore now, I believe, and I don't know where our listeners are. And you also talked about in that previous book about supply chain disruptions. Now we very much are. We do have a sort of supply chain war going on, and a lot of debate about that. Talk about the ways in which you anticipated where we are today, and where maybe you didn't anticipate where we are today.
So there's two levels to that. One is the infrastructure, the geography of supply chains, and the competition to be either the central node of production or to control the technological innovation. And in that book, I call it the horizontal and the vertical levels of supply chains. So trying to be the preferred producer of whether it's semiconductors or whether it's oil, and the US is a leader in technology and is now a swing producer in energy. So the US is horizontally very connected and relevant in technology, finance, and energy. And then vertically, which is to be the kind of, to control the innovation and the value added. And there, the US is still absolutely vital, but innovation is spread very rapidly. And you certainly have in areas like AI and in additive manufacturing, a tremendous innovation in the rest of the world as well. And there's a vigorous competition to be the vertical leader, to be the innovator. That's where the R&D budgets are focused on that vertical level. And then trade and industrial policy are focused on the horizontal level. And on top of that, we continue to spend trillions of dollars a year on this connectivity infrastructure, whether it is high-speed railways, whether it's electricity cables that are spanning continents now, and of course, so internet cables, building more and more internet cables connecting all the continents. All of that, to remind everyone, is about promoting connectivity and flow. So you can, you can shut down borders all you want, but our global economy persists in many ways. One of the things I always remind people is that if you use one lens, which is trade, which is the thing that people tend to think they understand better, even that they get wrong because they think about everything as a finished good, made indigenously in one country, which of course it's not, which is part of the breakdown we're seeing right now, right? I mean, it's people like, oh, fine, well, Taiwan, can't produce enough semiconductors. Okay, but the silica, which is the most abundant element in the Earth's crust, I have like a homage to silica and sand in that book, has to be finished and prepared in China to be sent to the semiconductor plants in non-friendly, let's say, territories like Taiwan and Korea. And even as we further distribute semiconductor production out of Taiwan to escape the geopolitical scenario of a Chinese mainland seizure of Taiwan to grab TSMC, which is why TSMC is building plants as far as, of course, Arizona in the United States, Japan, Korea, maybe eventually India. The point is we continue to distribute and dissipate production in order to achieve greater systemic resilience, so that, which is a fancy way of saying, if one place stops supplying something, you can get it from somewhere else, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the world we need to build. And the more we invest in connectivity and distributed production, the more we get towards that kind of connectography sort of scenario. And we're doing it all the time. And we're doing it precisely because of the nefarious nature of geopolitics. It's not despite it, it's because of it. China builds Belt and Road, right? They build these infrastructures for their own national interests. It's to get the potash and the wheat from as far as Ukraine. It's to ship things over the Arctic and overland to Europe, its largest trading partner. But it benefits more than just China. It's dual use, if you will. So anyway, That's what I think is going on. And then the digital domain, just quickly, as we're all living, obviously, the internet infrastructure, right? And the fact that the share of the economy that is increasingly digital anyway, irrespective of whether or not a shipping container or tanker gets stuck in the Suez Canal, right? It doesn't really stop the digital economy. And we're not very good at measuring that digital economy. And we often overlook the financial economy, which rests on the same connectivity. And this is the point I was saying about when I lecture to students, like trade is billions. You could stop all physical trade. Finance is trillions. You know, if you really want to understand globalization, at least focus on dollars and bits, not just atoms, you know, dollars, bits, and atoms at a bare minimum, and people are at least your four pillars, if you will. If you want to properly measure globalization, look at all four, and you'll see that globalization is perfectly alive and well, fret not.
We've hyper connected virtually in the last year and a half since the pandemic. And is there anything we've learned about the limits of that, how it doesn't work?
Well, of course. I mean, look, people to people ties, you know, have blossomed in a way. At least people get to keep in touch and so forth. But, you know, my mother misses her grandchildren, right, and hasn't physically seen them. So it'd be nice for us to all get together again the way we used to. So that's obviously one dimension of it, where you can only compensate in a limited way. And of course, globalization is not itself a cure for inequality, right? By any stretch of the imagination. Connectivity doesn't cure. Connectivity can help some people. Let's say your job is analyzing or taking photos or tagging photos for Google Earth, and you're living in Uganda. You know, look, you are part of that connected global digital economy, and you're earning a far higher wage, but your village may still be lacking in running water. Right. So there's still lots of things that we need to focus on at a local level, which is why, actually, to be honest, I mean, the humanitarian message of the book is pretty simple. Sort of what are the principles that should guide our, again, cosmopolitan utilitarianism? It's if you cannot move people to resources, move technologies to people. Right. It's one sentence in the book, but I think it's a fairly simple law to live by. Right. Move people to resources, move technologies to people, and the world will be a better place.
And then I think this might be the final question for me. Just talk a little personally. You've traveled so much. You grew up in several different places around the world. How did that shape, you know, your thinking and your ideas? How did it turn you into the person you are today in terms of multiple strategies?
Yeah, I don't take it for granted. You know, it's a big part of who I am. For me, travel is a methodology, right? It's not just fun and games. You know, it's how I research, and it either reaffirms or contradicts everything that I read and research before going to a place. And I think it's helped me to kind of, you know, disprove or overturn or at least contradict ill-informed conventional wisdom on quite a few countries and places. And so, you know, like you have to substitute for it temporarily when you're in a lockdown-like situation. But I don't think for me there'll ever be another way of life than kind of traveling and exploring. So I'm lucky that my parents raised me that way. As an aside, I raised my kids that way. They've been to dozens and dozens of countries already. But you know, let's be clear that on the eve of the pandemic, and this is perhaps a good way to wrap up. You know, the year 2019, I was not alone as a kind of, footloose border crosser. 1.5 billion people crossed borders in the year 2019. That's an absolute record in human history. You know, whether it's business travelers, tourists, students, migrant laborers, you know, you name it. And then, of course, it stopped to a large degree. So again, I ask you to tell me that this one pandemic suddenly means the end of that mega trend, and I do mean mega trend, where 1.5 billion people cross borders and where nearly 300 million people were living outside of their country of origin. Now, quite a few million of those people went back home indefinitely. But of course, millions of people right now under our very noses are relocating to other countries because they have decided where they want to be if the next pandemic were to hit. You know, are we missing that? And then obviously, this is a crucial part of the book, gets back to the technology of all of this. This will be a learning experience, a reset in how we do mobility, because rather than just stamps in your passport, and of course, physical reporting on who's vaccinated and who's not. All of the stuff that's creating an even greater mobility divide right now. The mobility divide is widening precisely because Africans don't have QR codes to demonstrate their vaccine and certification. But imagine what we will have 5 years from now. And I do mean 5 years from now, not 15 years from now. 5 years from now, every human being is going to have that QR code saying they're vaccinated. And you'll be putting data on the blockchain about your travel history and financial history and education history and criminal history that's accessible only when needed to governments so that you can have access to that country. And we will digitize mobility because of this pandemic. So far from believing that it's a linear lockdown, it's very much the opposite. And I know, and I'm following and encouraging the companies that are building that future digital, a pathway to physical mobility for all of us right now. And I'm absolutely certain we're going to have it within literally 5 years. So that's an optimistic note, perhaps, to end on, that it'll be more seamless than before.
And if nothing else, I think the pandemic and the lockdowns have reminded so many of us of how desperately we want to get on the move again.
Yes.
To invoke your title. Anyway.
You and me both.
All right. Well, I think that probably ends it for us.
Yeah, thank you both so much.
It's
I just wanted to also wanted to throw back to the supply chain disruption. Speaking of that, your book, which was supposed to come out last Tuesday, is now coming out on the 12th. And
that's right.
It has to do with the pandemic and a lot of authors moving their books to the fall and now printing issues, But thank you both so much for being here, Parag. That was a fantastic conversation.
I really appreciate it. Thank you both. Thank you, Michael. Really, really
thank
appreciate
you, Parag. Good talking to you, and maybe you can give me some investment ideas about those companies.
Sure, why not? Let's have another chat.
All right. Take care. All right.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.